Good afternoon. I'm Technical Sergeant Esteban Salmon. I'm here with Staff Sergeant Allison Carr.
Hello.
Today, we're basically going to be going through two blocks that we would normally teach as part of our resiliency training. The block I'll be covering is Bring Your Strengths, and then Sergeant Carr will be covering the Reframe portion of our resiliency skills. Just a little about myself. I've been here at Dyess for just going on 5 years. I have a wife, 3 kids. I've been in the Air Force for 12 years, and I work over in 7 CMS in the avionics back shop.
My name is Sergeant Allison Carr. I work as a dental assistant here in the clinic. I'm married, and I have 2 beautiful children.
All right. Well, I guess we'll just jump right into it. I'm going to, like I said before, cover the first portion of this live stream, which is the Bring Your Strengths portion. So normally when we teach these blocks, we normally teach them one after another, covering a wide variety of topics. So we're basically going to do our best to teach these blocks, assuming no prior knowledge as far as the other resiliency blocks and modules that are usually taught. It's usually taught in one big, all at once, essentially. So I'm just going to jump right into Bring Your Strengths. So when I think of Bring Your Strengths, it's essentially what the title says. It's about not just learning and knowing what your strengths are, but knowing how to fully and effectively utilize those strengths. And obviously, different strengths can be used for different situations and whatnot. So that's another part of the challenge of not just knowing what your strengths are, but knowing when and where to use them. The first part of this block, we'll get back into that later. So if you can see a slide right now, the main purpose for the Bring Your Strengths is that it improves engagement and purpose. It can energize and boost mission performance amongst members, builds meaning and well-being, and leaders who recognize these strengths improves individual and team performance. So here we go. This is what I was trying to get into a little sooner. I was jumping the gun there. So now we're going to talk about what your signature strengths are. So what the term signature strengths is referring to, so there's actually a survey called the Values in Action Survey, and you can find it by simply just Googling Values in Action survey. It's about a 15 minute survey that you can take that will allow it, just ask you a bunch of different questions. It'll feel like an aptitude test, and based on your answers, it will give you what your signature strengths are, and it pulls from a list. It's a fairly expansive list from what I can just looking at it here on my paper here. Looks like there's close to 30 different strengths that the survey will pull from, and it'll give you like your top 3, which are your signature strengths, and then it'll give you, your bottom strengths, so on and so forth. So to go in a little more depth of what these strengths are, they're those that you own, celebrate, and exercise frequently, sometimes without you even knowing. I know when I first took the Values in Action survey, the top signature strength that showed up, I was completely caught off guard, and it was appreciation for beauty and excellence.
That was yours.
And it caught me off because I didn't really understand what it meant.
Uh-huh.
There are things on here like creativity, forgiveness, gratitude. I understand that. I know what gratitude is. I know what fairness is. But appreciation of beauty and excellence, I really had to dig into what that really meant. And I can go into that a little later as far as what came out of that. But to continue, understanding your signature strengths helps you feel like you have a better sense of authenticity and excitement, especially when you actually get an opportunity to use these strengths. And overall contributes to the best version of you, especially in your workplace or at home, in any really sort of interpersonal situation. So here we are, like I mentioned before, the Values in Action survey. As you can see on the slide, kind of what I already explained, gives you that rank ordered list of your strengths. And then your top 5 strengths, I think I said top 3, so it's actually your top 5 strengths are what your signature strengths are. And then here's that list I was talking about. And as you can see, it's a wide variety of different attributes. And again, like I mentioned, it's easy to know what a lot of them are. I remember I taught an FTAC class, and I had a first term airman ask me what zest was. And again, that was a term, we've used that term.
Right.
You think of zest or zesty, but I didn't really know how to explain it as far as like how to relate it to what having zest means. So I ended up actually Googling it on my phone on the spot during that classroom, and it was a lot of fun. So now we're looking at what are the typical most common signature strengths that people get. Kindness, fairness, honesty, gratitude, judgment. And you can see how a lot of these strengths basically tied directly into our core values, as airmen. You have honesty right there, fairness, which I think goes right into, integrity first and things like that. I would say something like judgment would tie more into like excellence in all you do. Having the good judgment to make the right decisions,
right.
and not just jumping to conclusions or, taking the quick and easy route as opposed to doing it the right way.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then you can see their least common is prudence, humility, and self-regulation. So I think and this is just my assumption, I don't really know all the facts, but I would assume that one of the reasons those are on the lower spectrum as far as least common is I think they're the toughest things to do.
Oh, yeah.
You look at something like humility, it can be really hard to be humble, especially if you're in a position of power or leadership. And then of course prudence, and then that sort of goes with self-regulation, which we'll kind of talk a little bit about with your reframing module. So we'll jump more into that later. So when it comes to identifying your strengths, again, the best, I guess you could almost say textbook way to do this is by taking that survey. That'll at least give you the groundwork of sort of what you can look for, how you can identify. But I'm sure a lot of you out there, and I know even before I took the values and action survey, I knew what some of my strengths were, kind of going into that. So something you can do, at home or whenever you have the time, this live stream will be posted, so you can always go back and rewatch this if you want to use this activity as a reference. But think of a time when you used not just the signature strength if you take the survey, but just think of a time you used a strength that you have. So let's say you're a good communicator, you're good at solving interpersonal problems. Think of a time you actually effectively utilize that. And don't just tell yourself, oh yeah, I solved this problem, I used my good communication skills, cool, I'm great at communicating. No, like really sort of audit yourself, really take a hard look of how you can improve. Because I'm a firm believer that you can improve anything.
Oh, yeah.
You can take the best example, or let's say you performed really well at a certain task, and I feel like there's always ways you can improve upon that. So like it says on the slide, think of a time you use these strengths, write a few sentences on how you used it, take a few minutes to share with a partner, or if you just kind of thinking to yourself, little alone time, you can do that as well. Just sort of, like I said, evaluate how you performed and things you can do. And you don't even have to necessarily think of things you can do better. You can just think of ways maybe just to do it differently.
Right.
We have these different strengths, and I would say it would be unreasonable to think we can use the same strength the same way for every situation. So we're getting all right. So how did your strengths match your values? Again, when we talk about values as far as like resiliency skills, this is one of those things that is talked about a little more in depth in previous portions of these resiliency skills. But just a quick breakdown, your values it's pretty self-explanatory. They're things that you value as a person, and your values can come from your culture, from your family, how you were raised. An example I like to use in our first term airman classes that we teach is, let's say I'm somebody that I love cars. I grew up, helped my dad rebuild, some old car, and now I'm just passionate about it. Mm-hmm. That is an example of something that I'm value based on my experiences, life experiences, and just what you're into. So your values, long story short, your values can be the culmination of anything, not just hobbies, things that you're good at. It's all based on, like I previously mentioned, your culture, how you were brought up, life experiences, things like that. So identifying your strengths isn't necessarily enough. Again, like I mentioned before, it's about how you utilize those strengths. But when it comes down to the core of resilience and how it relates to that, you're enhancing your own resilience by finding new ways to develop and use them. And I kind of touched on this a little earlier, trying to find new ways to utilize your strengths, even seek opportunities. I actually didn't know that I was as good at public speaking as I was until I really started doing resiliency training and teaching first-term airman courses. And once I realized that I was very comfortable with public speaking and that I can usually be very clear and concise, again, I sort of audited myself, and I would ask a lot of the students, like, hey, how did you think I did? Are there things you think I could have done better? Get the opinion, of a person, or, like I did in that situation, from a classroom full of new airmen. So, and I ask my coworkers all the time, right now I'm a production supervisor, so I got a lot going on, and my subordinates and my airmen and peers are always coming to me with questions, and I definitely have made it very known in my shop that they should feel free to come to me, or not come to me, but they should definitely not hold back if they really feel like they need to tell me, hey, Sergeant Salmon, maybe you could have done this a little better, or they know that I enjoy that open dialogue, even if it's critical in nature. So I definitely use those examples or those situations to constantly change the way that I run our section, however you want to put it.
I think isn't that one of the strengths where you are able to have a good perspective or wisdom? And I feel like by your subordinates and your peers knowing your strengths, they know that they can come to you
absolutely.
for a certain. So I think it's very important that not only that we know our own strengths, but even the strengths around us. So then, like you mentioned before, it kind of helps the effectiveness of the team.
Absolutely. Yeah. So we'll kind of get into this discussion and ask the question, how can you bring your strengths every day when facing new challenges? I'd say one, and I like to speak from experience a lot. I just feel like it's easier for me to really explain sort of what I'm trying to say. I know one thing I try to do every day is just keep a positive attitude, especially nowadays with the way things are with, the coronavirus and the changes we've had to go through as far as our day-to-day operations, all the different restrictions that, are on military right now. And I just try not to get lost in that muddle. I try to just focus on what's important. Right now that's my kids because they're not in school. So, I'm trying to focus on making sure they maintain at least some degree of education, trying to keep them entertained. They're home all day. Kids don't really go outside and play much anymore because I'm sure parents are, they have their fears about coronavirus and whatnot. And then, of course, work. I'm still going to work. I don't telework at all. So just coming in and being ready to face it, man, ever since we've changed our shifts a little bit, every week has had tons of new challenges. And honestly, the biggest challenge for me has been being a production supervisor. Before everything kicked off with the coronavirus, I was kind of an interim production supervisor. I would step in if I needed to, but most of the time there was another tech who outranked me who was the guy. He was the go-to guy. But now that we've split our shifts up a little bit, now I got thrust into that position full time, essentially.
Oh, nice.
So that's been challenging. I've always wanted to be. I've always felt like I could be a good production supervisor, so I was ready in that sense mentally. But of course, you can't. I can sit here and tell myself, "Oh yeah, I'd be a good production supervisor," but at the end of the day, you don't know until you're finally in the seat.
Yeah.
So, and then when it comes to facing new challenges, obviously the biggest challenge that we've all had to face is the coronavirus. It's what's dictating this live stream right now, because our ability to actually meet in person and be able to talk to you live in real life has been hindered by this. So I think this is awesome. When I first saw the email about this live stream idea put on by the top 3, I was like, man, that is awesome. That's a great idea, and I definitely want to get in on this. So I'm glad I was able to snag a slot here. But just to kind of bring it back with strengths, I think right now, with everything going on and all the changes we've all had to adapt to me, this is actually more about not understanding your strengths. Of course, if you have the time, give yourself that opportunity to find out what your strengths are if you don't already know, and reevaluate those strengths. But really, this is the time on when we need to be utilizing our strengths to their full effectiveness. If I'm in the shop, if I'm in my work center and my flight chief gives me a bunch of direction, or I need to brief something to the whole shop or whatnot, I don't have time to sit here and be like, oh, well, I'm not comfortable with talking, or I don't know how to communicate these orders or this task or whatever it is effectively. I just need to do it.
Yeah.
We don't necessarily have the time to really get in to all the nitty gritty, and then later I can go back and be like, okay, I completed my task, I accomplished what I needed to. Now I can really look at, hey, how can I improve that. So I think my biggest piece of advice would be, if you don't already fully understand your strengths, get there.
Yes.
You need to get to that point. Whatever you need to do, take the time to, if it isn't the survey that we mentioned earlier, the values and action survey, just take a moment and just think to yourself, give yourself a little bit of private time and just think, hey, what are things that I excel at, especially in your job? I've been told I'm good at this, or I already know I'm good at this, or whatever strengths you come up with on your own, and then really dig into how you can fully utilize those strengths and spread your strengths. That's another thing that isn't really mentioned in the official resiliency training modules, but I try to find opportunities to not just use my own strengths for my own good, spread that to your peers and your subordinates and supervisors, give them a heads up, like, hey, I heard you were having trouble with this certain task. Here's what I've done to have success, and ask for that feedback. And if you're struggling with something, ask them, be like, hey, I heard you're really good at doing this task, whatever it is, hey, can you help me out? I've always struggled with this thing. So, communication couldn't be more important than it is right now.
Yeah, that's good.
Was there anything you wanted to add to that?
Oh.
Or at this point, I guess I feel like I do. Once you get me talking, I can really get going. So I don't want to.
No, I completely agree. That last point, I really, I think knowing your strengths, and even in the survey, it shows you what's on the little bit of the lower end. And for me, I find great freedom in knowing what I might need help in, because then, I'm not too ashamed to say, hey, sir, could you help me in this area? So I definitely agree with that. That was good.
Cool. All right, I think we'll push forward. So this is another activity that you can utilize if whenever you have the time. And pretty much, I guess just a short disclaimer, pretty much all these activities that we go over, really only require the use of a pen and paper at the most. Obviously, it can be better if you can have someone else, like a partner, whether it be a spouse or, maybe a roommate or whomever you're around at the time, just to kind of get that feedback. And it just depends on the activity. So with this one, though, and we've sort of already discussed this, sort of gone over, I've sort of mentioned it to some degree, but says, think about a new way to use one of your strengths in your AFSC. How can your strengths contribute to your unit's mission? Are there ways you can bring your strengths to your personal life or to a challenge you are facing, which we already talked about. One big challenge we're all facing right now. And discuss how you can bring your strengths with a partner. So, and again, I definitely can't reiterate enough how beneficial it can be to discuss strengths with someone else. Getting that candid feedback can go a really, really long way. So I guess we're getting near the end of this portion. Just to kind of go over what we've talked about. Overall, the skill can improve your engagement. It builds meaning, not just for yourself, but with everything you interact with. You know, it gives meaning to your job and to your personal life, to your friends. And even furthermore, it can help your coworkers and friends and family understand your own meaning as far as what you value and how that pertains to your strengths and so forth. Of course, find new ways to develop and use your strengths, personal life, at work. Understand how your strengths can contribute to your unit's mission. And I guess that's it. I will say I'm used to these slides being a little different. I've gotten as familiar as I can with these slides. Basically, there used to be a lot more.
Oh yeah.
There used to be, and I wouldn't necessarily say it's a bad thing that they kind of shortened it. I feel like obviously their goal was to just consolidate.
Right.
But in any case, trying to think if I really have anything else to add when it comes to strengths. I feel like I've said all I can about it.
Yeah, that was good.
Did you have anything to add or
No,
any
I don't have anything
questions
to add.
about it?
No, but if you all watching have anything that you would like to add, please go ahead and type it in the comments, and we'll go ahead and answer your questions for you. So right now we're going to talk about Reframe, and this is a great skill because it does require a lot of self-regulation, as we talked about earlier. And what reframing does, it helps you to be aware of your thoughts and how it relates to the way that you respond to certain things, and how you the emotional and physical reactions that you get to certain events. That's what reframing is all about. So we talk about reframe because we want you to know that there is a difference between your thought and the response or the reactions that comes from those thoughts. So let's go ahead and dispel a quick myth really quick. So a lot of times when something happens, an event happens, you approach a situation, a lot of times people believe that whatever emotional response or physical response happens, that's the reaction that's going to happen. And Sergeant Salomon, he gave me a great example, if you wouldn't mind sharing what we talked about a little bit earlier.
So basically, the myth is that if something happens, we call it the activating event, that you just respond, and that it's not really in your control, which is true to some extent. An example I like to use is like getting rear-ended. You get rear-ended in your vehicle, and I'm sure most people's immediate response is either some degree of fear, especially if you have kids or a passenger in your vehicle. But I feel like most people's initial, or maybe not initial, but one of their other reactions is anger. Like, oh man, this person just hit my car. Now all these things are racing in their head about what they have to do to deal with it, and it's going to take time and possibly money and all these different things. So you get upset. It's especially because, and that's why I like using getting rear-ended as a good example, is because it's something that happens so suddenly and unexpectedly.
Right.
So that degree of surprise can really, what it really does is prevent you from taking a moment and thinking about what's important. So that's the myth. So the myth is that something happens and you have a response. But what the truth is that there's a thought process that happens almost instantaneously.
Right.
And the goal of reframing, or what Sergeant Carr is explaining, is the ability to stop yourself in that middle portion. So instead of it just being the activating event and then the emotional or physical response, there's a point in the middle that you don't even think about unless you train yourself to.
Right.
It does take a certain degree of mental discipline, and even which is really just mindfulness. I'm sure we've been hearing, or if you study any kind of psychology or meditation, we hear about mindfulness all the time.
Yeah.
And mindfulness is essentially just taking a second to just think about what's happening in that moment.
Absolutely.
So that's really the goal of that middle port.
Yes, sir,
portion.
absolutely. And so that middle portion is really based on, each individual. So we all may respond, like you said, to that rear ending a certain way. Someone who absolutely loves their car might respond in a different way than someone who just has a beater and they're just trying to get from point A to point B. So the reality is this: there's an event, there's an activating event, and before a reaction happens, your thoughts happen. And so in those thoughts, they're all based on how we perceive things. They're based on our values, our beliefs, and that's what drives our emotional or sometimes physical reaction. And keep in mind, what most people see is usually the physical behavior, the physical reaction. So one of the examples we like to use in this briefing is, a driver pulls out onto an intersection. So when that activating event, a driver pulls out and they weren't supposed to, our thoughts and the way we perceive it, some of us may perceive it as like, what's going on? That person was in the wrong. It was, I have the green light, let me go. And then what that can do is create an emotional response, which can sometimes be anger, maybe frustration, annoyance. And then oftentimes there's a physical reaction. You might have the urge to tell that person that they're number one, but with a different finger. So there could be a physical reaction there. So reframing, what does reframing do for us? It gives us the opportunity to evaluate our reaction. So if you can just think about a time that maybe you gave a reaction that was maybe not favorable, you want to ask yourself, does my reaction interfere with my goals or interfere with my mission? Does the reaction line up with my values? We were talking about that a little bit earlier. We do a lot of things we want to do a lot of things based on our values and our beliefs. And also, does our reaction help or hurt the situation? So that's very important to note. So when do we use reframe? So we use this to understand why we react in a certain way. We use it when our reactions aren't helpful. And then also, if we don't like the physical reaction that we give occasionally, we use this reframing to slow down and really think about it. So I want to do a quick activity with you guys, and you don't have to do this right now, but what I would like you to do is, if you can just think, and this may not be too hard since we're all in quarantine right now, think of a time where your reaction was something that you really want to change. Maybe it wasn't terrible, but you just want to learn how to react in a different way. So just go ahead and write that down or take a mental note of that. If you need an example, maybe you guys are quarantined with your spouses, and maybe there might be some reactions there in the conversations that you had that were unfavorable. Or even your kids, you've given them things to do and they probably haven't done them, schoolwork, chores, whatever the case may be.
Well, and one thing I'd like to add is, don't underestimate the power of the small things too. So, before I sort of talked about how you have to have the mental discipline to train yourself to kind of stop yourself in those moments before you have that emotional physical reaction. That's really hard to do.
Oh, yes.
Especially if the event is something major, like getting in a car wreck, or I can't really think of other examples, but you understand there's a difference between maybe getting a paper cut and then getting a more severe injury. There's a big scale, I guess. Whatever you want to call it. But basically, the best way to train yourself is to do it for the small things. So let's say you do get a paper cut, and instead of freaking out, or I don't know, I guess it kind of depends on who you are. I know some people get more squeamish with blood than others, things like that. but use that opportunity, no matter how small it is, to stop yourself and be like, okay, you know, let's evaluate what's going on. You know, I got a paper cut. Yeah, it hurts, but actually now that I'm looking at it, it's really not that bad. It'll probably heal in about 10 minutes or whatever it is. Do I really need a Band-Aid for it? You know?
Yeah.
And obviously, depending on the situation, you don't want to, if it's something immediate that you need to have an immediate solution to, don't sit there and evaluate what's going on. You know, if you're, I'm trying to think of another example. I don't know. I guess you could almost.
You said a good one earlier. Your
Which one
kid
was
dropped
it?
something on the floor.
Oh, yeah. So we were talking a little bit before the stream, and an example I brought up was just like your kid spills something on the floor. You know, that's an example of where you can take the time to really evaluate how you react to it.
Right.
So, you know, without that mental training, your initial reaction is probably going to be, you know, that you're upset, you know, especially if you just cleaned the floor or they got it on your nice rug or whatever the situation. But really try and stop yourself for a moment and think about what's important.
Right.
You know, and when it comes to things with my kids, one of the first things I ask myself is, okay, did anyone get hurt?
Yeah,
you know,
that's a good one.
You know, did they spill the cereal because of something? You know, did they run into something? Did they trip on something else that was on the floor? You know, so I always think about their safety.
Right.
But once I move past that, you know, then I start thinking, okay, is this really something worth getting mad over? Is it really something worth getting upset over? And you might think, oh, great, now I have to clean this. And one thing I'll try to do is I'll tell the kid or whoever it was that spilled it to clean it.
Yeah.
You'd be like, hey, turn it into a teaching moment.
Yeah, absolutely.
And if I had just let myself get upset or angry about it, I wouldn't have even thought about turning it into a teaching moment.
Right.
I probably would have just yelled at my son or my daughter or whoever it was, you know, oh, why did you do that? You know, you're making a big mess, and gone off on some tangent or something. But instead, you know, take that time to be like, you know what, you made the mess, clean it up, and I'll check it and see if you did a good job, and, you know, you go from there. So,
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So if you want to take a moment and look at the screen there, take a screenshot of it if you need to. But I think this is a very helpful tool to, if you are all about that mental discipline. I really like that terminology that you use. If you want to practice that and you kind of fix the way that you react or respond to certain situations, just go ahead and first describe the event. Be very specific, be brief and objective. What happened? Record your thoughts during that process. What were the things that you were thinking about during that? And what were your reactions? Please be sure to record those reactions that were physical as well as emotional. And then just ask yourself, did my reactions, were they helpful or were they harmful? Did they interfere with you know, my goals or my missions? And did they line up with the values that I hold dear? So if they were hurtful or harmful, if they interfered with your values, then ask yourself, how can I reframe the event? And what I like that you mentioned earlier is that a lot of times we can be proactive with this. You know what your triggers are. We know the things that really press our buttons, and you know what your automatic response typically is. So you can take those times and really, you know, set aside time to really think about, okay, if I have this altercation if I come in contact with this coworker, or if my kids do something crazy, if my spouse says this thing, how can I reframe? How can I prepare myself to respond to this in the right way?
Well, I would say that you have to be proactive. Oh,
yeah.
You know, especially if you've never tried any of these mental exercises before, and this is all very new. And of course, the older you get and the more experiences you go through, especially negative experiences, the harder it is to really train your mind to take those brief moments of mindfulness, or whatever you want to call it. And that's why I say start with the smaller things.
That's good.
But repetition is important too. And, you know, I do understand that, you know, I wouldn't, if I was teaching this to a first-term airman, you know, I wouldn't expect them to just go to their shop the next day and just be this expert at mindfulness and being able to reframe their mind and, you know, turn every situation into a positive experience. It is difficult and it takes time. It's literally like anything else, practice makes perfect. but this is even harder because it's a mental exercise.
Exactly.
You know, if I need to practice ping pong, you know, it's easy. I just get a ping pong table and just start hitting away until I get better at it. You know, it's pretty straightforward. But when it comes to, anything that has to do with just your mind and your thinking process, you really have to take a moment to separate yourself from everything. You know, don't have any distractions. You know, you kind of have to have a game plan on what you want to improve as far as your own mental discipline and your ability to, you know, catch yourself in those situations. So, so it can be hard. That's the bottom line. It can be hard to remember to take the time to actually reframe.
For sure.
So the bottom line is the more you can do it, the more you can really apply it and just take a second to think back, you know. And I think that's one of the reasons I like teaching these kind of resiliency skills, is because my hope is that someone that I taught, whether it be a first-term airman or a group of airmen, it would be awesome to know if they were like, oh yeah, I remember when that Sergeant Salmon guy was talking about mindfulness and taking the time to think, you know, now I can apply that. So if this is your sort of first introduction to that, then, you know, I would say that's a good accomplishment on our end. Or I would consider that a good accomplishment. So.
Yes, absolutely. So just to do a quick review, reframing is all about taking the time to pause and consider your reactions and your responses to different activating events and situations. So we're just evaluating and making sure that they are helpful and not hurtful. So at this time, if you guys have any questions, did you have anything to add to the reframe skill?
Not right now. Like I said, I can probably elaborate more if hopefully we get some questions. So we'll take it from there.
So please give us any of the questions that you may have. We'll take those.
Our first question is from Master Sergeant Tester. He says, Tech Sergeant Sullivan, in your opinion, what is a common character strength a follower looks for in a leader?
That's a good question. So what is a common character strength that a follower looks for in a leader? I think a big one is fairness. I think I know I can speak from a lot of my own experiences that I know one of the things I find myself trying to, I guess, help my airmen with is making sure that whatever decisions I make or whatever decisions are being made, even above my head, had the right thought and time put into it that's going to not just make sense to the airmen and our subordinates, but that's simply going to be fair to them. And then I understand, you know, we're in the military, you know, there are plenty of times where, you know what, you just got to do what you're told, you know, based on the situation. But there are also plenty of times where I feel like as a leader, I can kind of step in and be like, hey, actually, let's evaluate this. Maybe there is a better way we can do this. Or maybe there's a way we can just change things here and there that is going to help our airmen understand what the true purpose behind this is. Because in my experience, you know, most airmen don't start questioning how things are done because the task is hard or because they just think it's dumb. You know, most airmen in my experience, they start to question tasks when they don't make sense. You know, and if we as leaders can't effectively communicate what we're trying to communicate, then that's where it starts to break down. And just our airmen not being able to have that knowledge and that ability to understand what we're trying to tell them, that could be a big problem. I would say another one, though, is, I'm just kind of looking at my list here.
I think with the fairness, I think that kind of ties hand in hand even with like integrity. Having a leader that you know is fair and operates in integrity, I think kind of gives followers that confidence, knowing that their leader's going to do the right thing, you know, no matter what.
I would say another one is humility also. I kind of touched on this before when I mentioned that one pitfall that's really easy for leaders, especially new leaders. If you're taking on a new position or you're put in a higher position and given more responsibility, it can be really easy to just lose that humility or not even. And I think it really comes from when your position changes, you're used to a certain level of humility. God, I can't talk. Humility that you need. So I guess what I'm trying to say is the difference between like a flight chief and a wing commander. The wing commander has a very different job and a scope and things that he's responsible for than a flight chief does.
Yeah.
Both are important positions, but I feel like as a leader, you need to understand what kind of humility you need.
Yeah.
So, I would say, if you're a wing commander, you need to be cognizant of all sorts of things because all eyes are on you.
Oh, yeah.
You have your community that's looking to you for guidance and assistance. You have all the subordinate units and the groups that are all looking to you for that kind of, there's a ton of things that you need to consider,
Right.
I feel like, as a wing commander. But as a flight chief, understanding that smaller scope, like, hey, I'm in charge of this flight. My flight is roughly like 50 people. So the difference between understanding things on a larger scale and the things on a more personable scale. So I guess that's the best way I can explain it. I hope that kind of makes sense to everybody.
Good.
So, but yeah.
The next question comes from Airman First Class Stephanie Seeley. In my personal experience, from being a civilian worker to now military, the transition has been hard. And 8 tips on how to make it an easier transition.
Tips on how to make it an easier transition.
From civilian to now military. So thank you for that question. I think, so I don't know how much I can speak on that, just because I always saw myself joining the military. It was something I considered strongly right out of high school. I joined about a year after I graduated, and because I tried the college thing, didn't really work out. I think the biggest thing to understand is grow your knowledge base.
That's good.
The more you understand, and I'm mostly talking from the experiences I've seen in our younger airmen, our newer airmen that are coming in, and the things that they struggle with most. And I find that the solution to a lot of their problems most of the time is that they just don't know. It's just a matter of knowledge and knowing what to do. If I have an airman who comes up and asks me, hey, I'm about to get married, what do I need to do on the military side to, get my wife or my spouse in Dyess? How do I get her on my TRICARE, my health insurance? How do I get them on the life insurance, make them a beneficiary, like all these things that tie into adding a new family member. And the same can be said for when you have children. It's just having that knowledge base, and that knowledge base comes straight from your supervisors. So my best advice to you would be talk to your supervisors as much as you can. And if your supervisor doesn't have the answer, or at least doesn't know how to get you the right answer, then this actually brings me to something I tell my airmen all the time, and I tell my first term airmen classes that I teach, find that person in your work center, because I can almost guarantee every work center has that person that just knows everything.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to be your direct supervisor, who might be a staff sergeant or a tech. If it happens to be a master sergeant or your flight chief or even your shirt, if that's the person in your organization that just can answer all your questions, go to that person. And obviously you don't want to, depending on who it is, you don't want to give the perception that you're just always going to jump your chain of command. Use your chain of command as much as possible, but just find that person who probably has the answer, or at the very least knows how to get you that answer.
And I would add to that, if you could, I find it a lot easier when I find someone that can kind of walk the journey along with me when it's, those difficult situations. So if you can find someone, it could be a mentor, or maybe, someone who's very motivated, a peer, that you guys can kind of just you can vent to, you can talk to, and you guys just kind of walk this journey together, because I can see how that could be a very tough transition. Just like you, I joined right out of high school, and I grew up in a military family, so that kind of made things a little bit easier.
Yeah, you probably knew a lot
right.
that a lot of people didn't know.
Exactly. So, I'm used to the transitions. I'm used to moving and friends leaving, so there was a lot of it that I was quite used to. So I think one of the greatest things that's helped me in a difficult transition is just having someone that I can count on that may have went through something similar, but that can really walk that journey with me.
And of course, just be patient.
Yeah.
Because the military, is very unpredictable, especially now with everything going on.
Absolutely.
And so that's the best thing you can do, is just be patient, with, whatever issues you might be having.
Yeah, that's good.
The next question comes from Sergeant Tester again. Sergeant Carr, what is your character strength? How has knowing your strength helped you in accomplishing your daily tasks?
Okay. Thank you, Sergeant Tester, for that question. I would say what my top, when I took the test, as well as what I knew prior to the test, was gratitude. I've made it a point to really be able to find things to be grateful for. And I don't know if you've ever heard the term, well, it's kind of like reframing, but your thoughts drive your attitudes. And so when I'm able to think and on the things that I'm grateful for and that I'm thankful for, then it kind of helps me to have a more positive attitude. So definitely gratitude is one of my strengths. What was the other part of that question?
How has knowing the strength helped you accomplish your daily tasks?
Okay. So knowing that one of my strengths is gratitude, it just kind of, when I'm approached with a task that might be difficult or maybe that I don't really want to do, yes, I've been there. Sometimes in the dental clinic it gets a little heavy in there. So, when I'm faced with tasks that may be difficult, or maybe I'm just not feeling it that day, what I have to do is learn how to capture my thoughts and really start to be grateful. And it kind of helps me to, focus on the things that are great versus constantly dwelling on the things that are, hard or unfavorable. So.
Can either of you or both of you come with an example of when reframing done by you or someone else helped to avert a poor decision, help find the real cause of a problem, or help improve mission effectiveness in some way? How reframing was actually used effectively.
Mm-hmm. I do have one example.
Yeah, go ahead.
So, with everything that's going on now, I think we're all just trying to figure it out. We're trying to figure out what our new norm is, and so we're leaders, ourselves, and our leaders are making the very best decisions that we can with the information that we have. So I know personally, just a very transparent moment, sometimes there may have been a decision that was made, and it's just kind of like, you're just like, okay, let me try to figure this out. What I did was, and I want to give a huge shout out to the Dyess 5-6. We went on a field trip to the Situation Room, and what it taught us is that leaders make the best decisions with the information that we have. And because of that exercise, I learned that although the decision that may have been made at that time seems questionable, I took that time to think and to think about that, instead of my reaction being frustrated or angry, whatever the case may be. For me, it was maybe frustration. I took the time to think. I know that our leaders are giving the very best that they can with the information that they have. And so that allowed me to kind of redirect myself to really just be calm and just be as supportive I can for the leadership and the decisions that they had to make.
Mm-hmm. So I would say I don't really have a single just big kind of defining example, but I would say that in the years that I've been a resiliency trainer, and just based on my own experiences, when I really think about it, I find myself reframing all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Like I don't know if it's just something I sort of trained myself to do, growing up, just based on my life experiences, or if it's something I honed more on in the military since I've been in. But I find myself reframing all the time with little things. And it kind of goes back to what I talked about earlier about, don't be afraid to try and utilize these skills and utilize these thought processes in even small tasks. I was thinking about it while you were talking. Whenever I have an airman come to me, or with an issue or a question, I don't just kind of brush it off. I'm not just like, oh, I don't know, go figure it out. Like, I really take the time to think about, okay, what could have caused this problem?
Yeah.
Why can he not find this thing, or whatever the issue is? And really, those are small examples of reframing. I think it's important to also know that reframing doesn't always have to be a negative event that happens.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
It can just be as simple as, hey, Sergeant Salmon, I can't find this tool, or I could have swore I left it over here. Obviously it's not the end of the world, but me taking the time and taking the time with this airman to figure out, okay, retrace your steps. When did you last use it? Do you know if anyone else could have picked it up and they're using it right now? Like, let's really evaluate the situation and what's going on.
Yeah.
That's reframing at its core. It doesn't necessarily have to be this negative event, like a car accident or a fight with your spouse or something like that. It's just those little day-to-day moments where we just take the time to use our mental skills, and like I mentioned before, that mental discipline to evaluate what's actually happening. Because in that same situation, I could have that same person come up to me, oh, Sergeant Salmon, I lost this tool. I could just be like, well, I hope you find it, or else we're all getting paperwork. So that's sort of the easy, no help sort of example. But yeah, so.
That's good.
Well, I guess we are running out of time here, and so I'd just like to say thank you, to the top three, especially Master Sergeant Tester, and I'm sorry I didn't get Sergeant Henderson, for not just allowing us this opportunity, and of course the top three, and just honestly the great idea this was, and being able to come in and do this. I don't know if I mentioned it before. Like I said, I'm very passionate about this stuff. I have found a lot of use and good that has come out of it in my experiences with it. So any opportunity I can get on to help others with these issues, I'm definitely excited and happy to do.
Absolutely. Thank you all so much for joining us. And just remember that we do this every Friday. So join us next week, and also invite a friend. So thank you.
This was a production of the Dyess Top 3 organization. Please see us at 1500 on both Thursdays and Friday. Have a great day.